The world looks to California to answer the hard questions, for redemption, to introduce the unfamiliar, to be resilient. Because California bounces back, holds us accountable, values who we are, remains vigilant, defies those in our way, and stands for community. Here on the West Coast, we're at the center of it all. Los Angeles Times, the state of what's next.
Hey, Malcolm, you know that Audible's got a lot more than audiobooks?
Of course, podcasts,
Originals,
bestsellers,
future bestsellers,
sleep stories.
sleep story. What are you talking about, sleep story? Malcolm. Oh, wow. Malcolm. Malcolm. Hey, no, Roxy. Hey, Roxy, get out of Malcolm's house.
The most inspiring minds, the most compelling stories, all in one place. Audible.
Good morning. I'm Matt Hamilton. I'm a reporter with the LA Times who covers legal affairs and corruption, and I'm your host for today's panel. Thank you all for tuning in to the 26th Annual Festival of Books and our virtual event this morning with Patrick Radden Keefe. Patrick is a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine and the author of the New York Times bestseller, Say Nothing, a true story of murder and memory in Northern Ireland. It received the National Book Critics Circle Award for nonfiction, among other lauds. His newest release, out last week, is Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty. It's a really devastating portrait of three generations of the Sackler family. The Sacklers are famed for their philanthropy. Their name graced universities and art museums around the world. Their fortune was built by Valium, but their reputation was destroyed by OxyContin and the havoc it wreaked across the country and around the world. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone to please remember to support your local independent bookstores during the Festival of Books. Copies of Empire of Pain are available to purchase through Vroman's bookstore in Pasadena. Please check that out. So without further ado, please welcome Patrick Radden Keefe. Hi, Patrick. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you.
Congratulations on the release of this book. It is your fourth book and on the Sackler family, and I just like to dive right in. First of all, just, when people today think of the Sacklers, they think of Purdue Pharma and OxyContin. That wasn't always the case. But just stepping back, what did you set out to do with this book? And specifically, is it a book about the opioid crisis? Is this a book about, a quintessentially American family? How did you view this book? And in setting out to do you think you accomplished it now looking at the finished product?
Thank you. I should say, first of all, thank you so much, Matt, for doing this. Thank you to the festival. I've done the festival before. It's a really, really wonderful institution and event. I just wish I could be with you in person.
Likewise.
And
yeah.
To talk about this book in particular is a thrill because as I relate in the book, the LA Times played a part in this story with some really groundbreaking reporting on Purdue Pharma and OxyContin. So it's a thrill to be with you. Thank you. In terms of the book, there have been a number of very good books about the opioid crisis. And I am hardly the first to report on the fact that the Sackler family, this very wealthy family that we associate with, until recently, we tended to associate chiefly with philanthropy, owns Purdue Pharma, the company behind the marketing of OxyContin. That story had been out there, but it had tended to be told kind of in the margins of like a broader approach to the opioid crisis or Purdue, or the story of OxyContin. And so part of what I was trying to do in the book, which started as a piece in the New Yorker in 2017, is focus quite closely on the family and tell a kind of multi-generational history of this dynasty, which has had such an impact on American life and the pharmaceutical industry and the way in which we are sold and marketed drugs, going back a long way before even OxyContin. And so, there were certain choices that I made. For instance, the first third of the book largely focuses on Arthur Sackler. It takes place for the most part in the 1950s and 60s, long before OxyContin is even invented. So there were decisions like that I think I was making in order to depart from the idea that it would just be a kind of, strictly speaking, an opioid crisis book.
How was the family able to preserve that space at the margins of what became, a scandal, quite frankly? How were they able to stay somewhat distant and tenuously affiliated, at least in the public eye, to Purdue Pharma and to OxyContin?
I think there are a number of ways to answer that. I mean, I think some of it is some of it was clearly, I now know, a very deliberate, concerted strategy on the part of the PR spin doctors who worked on behalf of the company and the family. There's some internal email that I quote in the book where people are saying, "Oh, there was an article about OxyContin and the opioid crisis, but the good news is there was hardly any mention of the Sacklers, and it was what was there was buried down low in the 12th paragraph or whatever it is." So I think there was a kind of deliberate strategy where they were actually spinning in that way, and at a certain point, kind of understood that that the company could weather negative media scrutiny. What they wanted to do was protect the family, in the words of one of the company lawyers. But more broadly, I kind of feel like our society is, in some respects, set up to insulate the very wealthy in precisely this way. So you had a whole series of institutions, some of which are now distancing themselves from the Sacklers, which for years, in the face of a kind of steady drumbeat of revelations about OxyContin and Purdue, just did nothing in the way of saying we don't want your money or we're going to ask any questions. I mean, there's an example I give in the book about another journalist who was on this story before I was, Sam Quinones, whose tremendous book Dreamland was published, and he writes about the Sacklers in that book and about the opioid crisis. And at Tufts University, there had been, which was a school that the Sacklers had donated to very generously over the years. There was briefly some suggestion that that book might get assigned to all incoming students. And then that decision was quietly scuttled because the administrators at Tufts thought that that might be awkward for their donors, the Sacklers. So it's this kind of crazy thing where it's not just that people at Tufts don't read Sam Quinones' work and think, my God, what are we doing? We have all these buildings named Sackler. It's that they actively suppressed the distribution of his book within the university.
Stepping back, you mentioned this grew out of your 2017 New Yorker article. So even you probably pitched this to your editor in 2016, 2017. How did you first make the connection? Oh, the Sacklers that are on all these museums and university buildings are the Sacklers behind Purdue Pharma. And walk us through that conversation with your editor at the New Yorker. I think there's often a reluctance among reporters to start writing or reporting on something that has been covered by other news outlets. And can be quite daunting to feel like you're entering into something that others are already picking at. What gave you the confidence to think, this story needs to be told, or this is something that I should, this is going to be worthwhile?
Well, I think when I made that connection myself about the Sacklers, I looked at the existing literature that was out there up to that point. So Barry Meyer, longtime New York Times reporter, had published a great book in 2003, very, very early on, called Painkiller, in which he wrote about the Sacklers. Sam Quinones' book, Dreamland, as I mentioned, had come out. The LA Times, where I came into this, of doing this series of amazing investigative pieces. And what was striking to me is that, notwithstanding that coverage, none of this seemed to have caught up with the Sacklers. And and that just struck me as strange, right? That you had this coverage that was out there, and yet the reputation still seemed, kind of unimpeachable. And so what I initially talked about with my my editor at the New Yorker was, what if we did a piece that was not the opioid crisis or OxyContin or Purdue Pharma, but it was just purely the Sacklers, front and center. They are the focus the whole way, and look at the philanthropic legacy, but also the legacy in terms of this very addictive drug that has generated billions of dollars for the family. And so, I think the fact that it had been written about previously was not a big, that probably wasn't a huge hurdle. There was a hurdle that's always there, very often there for me, because I often write these pieces, which is that the piece would be what we call a write around, where it's not as though the Sacklers were going to talk to me. I was not alone in that. At that point, they had never, ever, no Sackler had ever given an interview about the family business. And so it was kind of taken for granted that they wouldn't talk. And so that was really more the question, right? Is, can you write a compelling piece about a family if nobody in the family will talk to you?
Did you get a sense that it was an open secret while you were reporting that article, at least among their social set? Like, people, muttered among each other that, these people have their money from the opioid crisis.
Yeah, I did. I interviewed people who know the family socially, who said that it was something that was kind of whispered about, very rarely addressed explicitly with the individual members of the Sackler family. But as soon as they left the dinner party, it was something that people might whisper on their back.
The reaction to that article was huge. I mean, obviously, just as an observer, as a subscriber to the New Yorker, it was just overwhelming. People were talking about it. When did you think, oh, there's a book here? Was it shortly thereafter, or were there other subsequent developments that made you think, oh, there's? Because sometimes when I finish an article, the prospect of writing more about it, just I'd like to just put a bookend on it and move on. But what happened to make you think, oh, there's more here, and enough to make a book out of it?
Yeah, I mean, this will sound strange for me to say, given that this is now my third book that has grown out of a New Yorker article. But part of what I love about my job is that it's kind of okay to be a dilettante. That I can parachute into a story that I know nothing about and spend months learning as much as I can and trying to tell it in a compelling fashion. And then when I'm done, I'm done. And I just get to move on to the next thing. I don't have a beat like that. And so it's very, very often the case that I'll finish a piece and I just feel like I've scratched the itch. I don't need to go back or expand it or anything like that. And in this case, I didn't think there was a compelling book to write, because the family didn't talk to me. And I could really only conjecture about, I was so interested in what's the story they tell themselves. There's no way that when they tell themselves, when they privately talk about this, that they, that they're the villains in the story. And I really wished that they would, even just give me a statement or something for the piece, just so I could try and see it from their point of view. They didn't. This is, fairly typical of them, but they kind of blew off efforts to get them to talk. At the time in 2017, I just thought I couldn't do a book because it would just feel so remote. You would feel like you were reading about people that you didn't really know. And certainly for me, I mean, this is a complex, it's an incredibly complex issue. But I have I like to tell stories that are good stories, right? I think there's a certain kind of reader who won't necessarily pick up a book about the opioid crisis because it's about the opioid crisis, or a book about the Troubles because it's about the Troubles. But if you can um, seduce them with the undertow of a good story and compelling characters, then you can pull them into a subject that might have otherwise seemed not particularly interesting or even forbiddingly complicated to them. What that means for me is that, if something's going to be a book, I have to feel as though I can really get inside it and inhabit it and know these people and make you feel like you know them, even if they won't talk to me. And that just, in the universe as it existed when my piece came out, that was just not possible. The big thing that changed was that Maura Healey, who's a character in the last third of the book, she's the Attorney General of Massachusetts, and I think 49 states are suing Purdue Pharma. But Maura Healey was the first state attorney general to sue individual members of the Sackler family. And she got access to a huge amount of discovery, including lots of internal emails. And she released her complaint, which is hundreds of pages long, very, very detailed complaint that she released in January 2019. And at that point, it was one of these amazing things where I, as I said, I had been sort of forced to imagine in my mind's eye the way in which the Sacklers talked privately, and then suddenly here it was. It was like she kind of broke open the black box, and that it was at that point, that I felt as though it would be possible to write a book. And then given how completely appalling some of the stuff that she found was, I also felt a kind of, honestly, a sort of a kind of moral imperative to write the book. So I felt as though this is a story that needs to be told.
So you get the book greenlit, if you will, and what's your reporting to-do list look like then? Do you immediately, tell the family, hey, I'm writing a book about you. I'd love to talk to you. At what point, what are the various steps you take in trying to go about reporting this?
Well, so the first thing, this is often true when I do a big magazine piece. It was especially true with this one. After that piece came out in 2017, I started getting messages from people who had worked for the Sacklers or known them, or who had worked at Purdue Pharma. And these are people who I wouldn't have even known to get in contact with when I was working on the article. But once the article was out there in the world and getting sent around and read by people, these people would come out of the woodwork and find me. And so the first thing I did was actually just go back through my inbox and start reaching back out to people who had gotten in touch with me over the years. And just kind of putting together, as I usually do at the beginning of a project, it's almost like a big social network map of just all these different potential sources and people that I should try and seek out and talk to. And I got really busy with archival work because I knew that big parts of this book would be historical. The original 3 Sackler brothers were all dead by that point. Raymond, the last of the brothers, died in 2017. And none of those brothers, they were all very secretive, so none of them donated their letters anywhere, but they all had friends, it turns out, who were the kinds of people who would donate their letters to universities or archives. And so some of what I was doing was trying to track down artifacts, not just letters, but also like wedding invitations and bar mitzvah announcements and all of these incredible little artifacts, dinner invitations that Mortimer Sackler and his wife would send for kind of black tie birthday celebrations at his townhouse on the East Side. And I started seeking that stuff out at different archives. You name it. I did a lot of stuff. I did a Freedom of Information Act request with the Food and Drug Administration, which I knew that they would end up blowing off. So I then filed a lawsuit and sued them and took them to court and compelled them to turn over thousands of pages of documents. And I think the book, the fact that I was doing the book was announced publicly, like in the trades. And not long after that, the Raymond Sackler wing of the family started sending legal threats to me. So there was a kind of a dialogue, if you will, but a dialogue, via lawyers from very early on with them. But I should say with no prospect of interviews with the actual Sackler family members.
You went to law school, and I believe you wrote that your wife is a lawyer as well. I mean, when you get these legal threats, how do they affect your reporting process, if at all? Are you scared? Does it change how you go about reporting or telling the story?
Not really. I mean, I think it's a very counterproductive thing for people to do, in the sense that, at least with me, it's not going to intimidate me or make me slow down or scare me away. If anything, it's going to intensify my desire to get the story right, and to work extra hard to know that I have all the evidence in the world that I can marshal to prove that that the story I'm telling is a true and righteous one. So the idea that you would engage in some of these heavy-handed, slightly thuggish type tactics, I've never really seen the wisdom of that, honestly. Except that I think there's a long history of those kinds of tactics working. And I should say this is not true with all the Sacklers, but it's the Raymond Sackler wing of the family. I think it's like a learned behavior. I think that for a long time they had this sense that, Richard Sackler famously said, we have to hammer the abusers. I think they have a tendency to like to hammer things and people. And I do think for a long time that worked. In 2021, it's a weird press strategy, because if you have PR people who just call and shout at people and repeat the same not particularly credible talking points again and again, I don't know that actually does what you're hoping it will. But it may also be that the type of arguments that they're making at this stage are the type of arguments you make when you don't have any good arguments to make.
And as you point out in the book, they were very successful previously at using a variety of tactics to tarnish reporters, to persuade them from not covering the story a certain way, or quite frankly, destroying careers. At least that reporter down at the Orlando Sentinel,
Who she left, and this particular reporter down at the Orlando Sentinel, she left the business. She left the business altogether. But I mean, similarly, there was an amazing point. There's another thing that they do, which is I came to think of it as the "Can I see your manager" approach, where they love to go over people's heads, so they would write to me, but then also to various people at Doubleday, and then to the New Yorker, and there was a point where one of their representatives sent something totally gratuitous to the New Yorker, which is my place of employment, suggesting that I was like a reckless and irresponsible journalist. And it was funny because, in fact, fortunately, the New Yorker at this point, I think, has a pretty decent sense of the kind of journalist I am, and so I wasn't worried about my job. But it was an interesting move for them to make. But then again, when you see it in context, and this is part of the reason I wanted to tell this larger story, right, is that 20 years ago they did that with Barry Meyer when they went over his head to the brass at the New York Times, and it worked. They got him taken off the story by the New York Times. So, on the one hand, I find it to be a kind of, a sort of counterproductive and fairly desperate move to be reaching out to my bosses at the New Yorker and making these various claims about what an irresponsible journalist I am. On the other hand, I suppose, in fairness to them, right, that for years and years, these tactics worked.
Along those lines, there are, as you say, different wings of the family. And how did that complicate your reporting process? Were any of the wings ever playing off each other or trying to, exploit those divisions to protect themselves in this kind of familial conflict that you're covering?
It's a fascinating question. I mean, no, I wouldn't say so. There are three wings of the Sackler family, and the Arthur Sackler wing, as I mentioned, Arthur Sackler, I read about in the first third of the book. He dies in 1987, before the introduction of OxyContin. And Arthur Sackler's heirs get very, very upset when you mention his name in the same conversation as OxyContin or his brothers, because their view is he died before the introduction of OxyContin. They have not benefited financially from OxyContin. I very deliberately wrote about him in the book because I think, as I say in the book, the world in which OxyContin could do what it did was a world that was kind of invented by Arthur Sackler. He pioneered so much of the pharmaceutical marketing techniques and deceptive techniques that end up getting used with OxyContin. And so I wanted to tell that story, but they tend to feel that you shouldn't even mention him at all. The Raymond and Mortimer wings are interesting because in practice, they don't get along a lot of the time. And part of what I was trying to do in the book is show that it's not a monolithic Sackler family. There are all of these different individuals, and it's, I had multiple different people, sources of mine, who worked for the family or the company independently, compared the experience to being in the show Succession. You do have these various personalities in the different generations, and I wanted to try and capture some of that. But it's interesting too, because I think that the family, like there was a period of time when this lawyer who the Raymond Sackler side had hired to come after me, he wouldn't tell me who his clients were. So we had, my lawyer Doubleday kept saying, well, who exactly do you represent? And he would say certain members of the Raymond Sackler family. And we would say, well, what about this person? What about this person? And we couldn't get any clarity. And I've since seen in some documents that have come out that, in fact, there's members of the Mortimer side that have also been at least, CC'd on emails with him. And so there's a little bit of I'll put it to you this way. Historically, there's always been a bit of a shell game between the family and the company. And you get that even to some degree between the different wings of the family. It can sometimes be a little difficult to figure out with all the different lawyers and PR advisors, like who's calling the shots here? Who am I dealing with?
And do you have any clarity now as to who actually is calling the shots within these respective wings, or is it still opaque to you?
It's still somewhat opaque. I will say that there was a very revealing thing that came out just a few months ago. You have this company, Purdue Pharma, which has generated $35 billion in revenue since the 1990s. And you have a bunch of the Sacklers who were on the board of the company and really actively involved in terms of how that company was managed. And then you have a much larger universe of Sacklers who didn't play any executive role, weren't on the board, and say, we had nothing to do with any of this really. But they do benefit from OxyContin, right? These are people who are very wealthy, in large part because of the sale of OxyContin. And so I tell stories like, for instance, the filmmaker Madeline Sackler. There are some of these people who I write about in the book who, their claim is essentially, I should not have to answer any questions about this drug because I didn't make any of the decisions at the company, even if I have benefited tremendously from the wealth that it generated. And a few months ago, there was a WhatsApp log that came out in the context of the bankruptcy proceeding. And it was like a family chat with members of the Mortimer Sackler family. And it lasts for over a year. It's a lot of back and forth, all these messages, just members of the family. And what was really striking to me is that it was mostly people who are not actively involved in the company, but they were all weighing in a very active way on how the kind of PR situation should be handled. So it was just very striking to me, because I think that there's a sort of picture that is painted by some of the Sackler heirs, which is that, oh, there's the people who are involved in the company, and then there's the rest of us who are just kind of blameless, pure as the driven snow, out here making our independent films or doing our philanthropic work, but we have no connection whatsoever to OxyContin. I thought it was quite revealing to see that in private, they were all very eagle-eyed on the question of, well, how do we handle the PR? Who's doing this? Who's doing that? It was a very active, engaged family, even the people who never sat on the board.
You mentioned the bankruptcy proceeding, and you're reporting this and writing this at the same time that all these legal, the litigation, the bankruptcy are changing what facts are available. So could you talk about just what that was like to be writing up against that flux, if you will, and how that affected your writing process?
Yeah, I mean, I've never had an experience quite like this, in the sense that there were just so many documents. So there were huge amounts of material coming out in discovery. And then on top of that, a lot of stuff was getting leaked to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first part of the answer to your question would just be that I was just kind of overwhelmed by the amount of paper coming out. And there's this kind of storytelling challenge for me there, which is that over the years, I think I've gotten better at this, but there's a tendency when you read thousands and thousands of pages of files to want to kind of get credit, to like get a gold star for all the homework you did,
Yeah.
And it's been a kind of discipline I've had to learn, is to remember that the reader doesn't care if it took you 5 pages or 10,000 pages to arrive at the one perfect detail. All you can do is present the one perfect detail. What you don't want to do is, the one perfect detail and then a bunch of other dross that you happen to pick up along the way. And so that kind of distillation process it's always hard. And it was particularly hard here because there was such a huge volume of stuff. The other big challenge was that, as I often said in recent months, like, the end of my book was happening in real time. It was happening as I was writing. There was a guilty plea, a federal guilty plea, the second federal guilty plea by Purdue Pharma in November. There was a House of Representatives hearing at which 2 of the Sacklers testified for the first time ever in December. And, I had a draft of the book at that point. And so it was this thing where I was constantly having to kind of reshuffle the ending and figure out, how do I accommodate this? And then on top of all of that, at the end of the book, I'm not spoiling anything to say, it's not 100% conclusive, because there are still events playing out. The bankruptcy process is probably going to resolve itself in the coming months. I don't think it's a huge weakness in the book, in the sense that I think we have a pretty clear sense of how it's going to end, broadly speaking. And so I tried to capture that as best I could at the end. But there was just a lot of flux between all of the documents coming out, and then the fact that it literally did seem sometimes that every single day some new event was going down. But listen, I mean, I will say that was amazing for me too, right? Because there's a scene at the very end of the book, I'm not giving anything away, where I had been very frustrated by the bankruptcy proceedings because I found them to be extremely kind of antiseptic it was a bunch of like very self-regarding lawyers who always deal with each other, and they're all like repeat bankruptcy lawyers and a bankruptcy judge. Everybody knows each other. They all kind of had disdain, I thought, a sort of subtle disdain for the idea that there would be any real pursuit of kind of justice or these larger interests at play. For them, it was all about let's get an efficient deal, and and it could seem when this is all during COVID, right? So it was all telephonic hearings. And so I would dial into these hearings, and I was just like, God, these people it's amazing how out of touch they are with the actual stuff, the human stakes here. But I couldn't figure out a way to articulate that other than just editorializing myself. Mm-hmm. And very, very late in the game, it was just like a week or two before it was pencils down on the book. There was this one hearing where all these lawyers were jawboning the way they usually did. And one by one, these victims started breaking in, these people who had called in to say, I want to talk about my brother who died, who overdosed. And the judge would cut them off and tell them that, like this was not the forum. Nobody wanted to hear what they had to say right now. They weren't calendared to tell this story today. And we need to get back to the kind of the legal fine points. And so that was the sort of thing where had I finished the book earlier, I wouldn't have had a scene like that. And I for me, it ended up being a very kind of moving and revealing moment.
Mm-hmm. I mean, would you find yourself another day, more discovery or another filing comes out and you're kind of going back to different parts of the book to, season some new details or recast some paragraphs? I mean, is that, or was it, you had already locked in part, the first book and the second book, and you're kind of moving into the third part, just managing that real-time disclosure?
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely, book one was its own thing because it kind of is sealed off in 87, but in book 2 and 3, I was constantly revising, and I mean, it's going to sound strange to say so, but it kind of goes back to the point about distillation. A lot of the time, I had to pick the best evidence to illustrate something, and I would have like 5 or 6 internal emails that illustrated the same bad behavior. And so it's this question of, well, I'm just going to use one, maybe 2. And so sometimes it would be like that, where something new would come out in discovery, and I would say, oh, that's actually a better way to illustrate the thing that I tried to illustrate in whatever chapter 16, and I would go back and swap something out. It felt like an embarrassment of riches at times, right? Because I had all of this evidence that could be used to illustrate it. But at the end of the day, I had to keep remembering I'm not. It's funny because a few of the reviews have used words like prosecutorial to describe the book, and I feel, or indictment, and for me the whole point is it's not a legal brief. Like I think it's an amazing story, and I wanted to tell it as a good story. I think at the point where you are kind of larding it with too much evidence, it's not going to be an especially pleasurable read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in prepping for this, your New Yorker editor, Dan Zalewski, described you as having a prosecutorial zeal. So I definitely, I can relate to wanting to, you want to quote all 5 emails and not pick the best one. It's such a challenge. I mean, just a final, before we go into some questions from the audience, I mean, how did this compare to other projects that you've done, other books that you've written? Were there any surprises this time around that weren't present with Say Nothing or Chatter or other books that you've done?
I mean, I think probably the single biggest thing is that Say Nothing, and this would be true of my first 3 books, on some level, they were all about moral ambiguity. I mean, Say Nothing probably most of all. What was appealing to me about that story was that I think that part of what I was trying to show with that book is that a certain kind of glib moral judgment is maybe too easy to make. And if you look closely at things, they're often more complicated. That some of these are hard issues, and if you don't appreciate how hard they are, you're not thinking hard enough about them. And with this one, it was funny because, I mean, for me, this was sort of, I joked to my wife when I first started out that Say Nothing was all about moral ambiguity, and that this book was all about moral clarity. I mean, I do think that there are nuances, and part of what I've tried to do is look at all the different many Sacklers and their role to this story and to this crisis, and sort of look at them individually, and then also look at the institutional corruption and the FDA and so forth. But there was a kind of moral clarity in this one that I haven't had in a project in a while. So that was different for me.
Mm-hmm. Did that present challenges because there isn't that tension, and that it is black and white in so many ways?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It did. There were a couple of different ways in which it did. One is that I thought a lot about voice, and obviously some of these stories are pretty outrageous, and I felt some outrage as I was learning them and as I was writing the book, and I anticipated that some readers would feel outraged when they read it. But to me, that meant that it was important for me to dial my own voice back. That I didn't want to write it in a kind of tone of high moral dudgeon. I didn't want to put any spin on the ball. So that was a challenge. The other challenge, though, and in a way, this does go back to, this is sort of probably a commonality with Say Nothing, is that I wanted to try. I mean, it's the Sacklers, of course, would probably dispute this characterization, but I wanted to try and empathize with them as much as I could, even though they wouldn't talk with me. I didn't have any interest in writing a book, and I wouldn't have any in reading one in which it's about like kind of caricaturish, mustache twirling villains. I think that I think there's a lot of villainy on display here, but what was really interesting to me was just the psychology of it, and the collective psychology of it is, how does a family and a business, how do they get into this situation? How do they, how do you look at the kind of sustained criminal conspiracy at Purdue Pharma over decades, right? A guilty plea in 2007, a guilty plea in 2020, this family taking billions and billions of dollars out during that period of time. What I wanted to know was, what are the stories they're telling themselves to justify this, to make this okay? What's the version of this story in which they're the heroes, in which they're just misunderstood, and I have it all wrong? And I feel as though I did everything I could to get their version of events into the book. Now, personally, I find their version of events to be like wildly diluted, but it's pretty coherent and consistent, and I feel as though I captured it with some fidelity, in part because I was able to use their own words to do so. So if that makes sense, I mean, there was a sort of challenge associated with that, right? Where I was not actually looking to just kind of blithely demonize these people. I actually wanted to understand how it is that a group of people who have had every advantage and seem smart and well-educated and like they should maybe know better, could collectively have ended up in this place.
With your book, it does, you rely on a lot of legal proceedings and discuss the role of various high-priced, powerful attorneys and other handlers that they had that insulated them from a lot of consequence. And I think, you reserve a particular harsh tone for Mary Jo White. So I guess if you could talk about, as a lawyer yourself, or as someone who went to law school, and a lot of your other work has relied on attorneys and legal proceedings. I mean, what's your view of what culpability these lawyers bear in protecting the family, and what social harm and public health harm has come from Purdue Pharma.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I went to law school. As I said, my wife's a lawyer. A lot of my good friends are lawyers. There is a kind of an idea in the legal profession of zealous advocacy, the idea that as long as you're not violating the law or any of the profession's ethical rules, that there's really nothing that you shouldn't do in defense of your client's interests, and that it doesn't really matter whether your client is innocent or guilty, good for society, bad for society. It's an adversarial line of work, and I understand that it's necessary that you have that kind of a principle that operates. Having said that, I think what is weird for me, and maybe part of the reason I reserved special attention for Mary Jo White. I mean, she's hardly alone. There's lots and lots and lots of
No, yeah, there's lots of people to choose from. Yeah.
Giuliani, Eric Holder, Pat Fitzgerald. I mean, there's any number of big ticket, well-known lawyers from both sides of the aisle who are in and out of government, who have gone to bat for Purdue and the Sacklers. I think in the case of Mary Jo White, part of it is that she's at Debevoise and Plimpton, which is a firm that I very nearly went to work for myself as a summer associate. A lot of my law school classmates went there. I know a lot of associates and partners at places like that, and I think that the thing that I really struggled with is that in Mary Jo White's case, she goes and helps the company in 2007. And she basically helps defang this federal investigation into Purdue in 2007. And then after that, it would be one thing if you go in and you help them out, and then after that they say, okay, we're really going to get on the straight and narrow now. We won't do any more of the bad behavior that we did in the past. We've learned our lesson. But that's not what happens, right? We now know that they continue the criminal misconduct. They continue to do all this, many of the same things that got them in trouble in 2007. I quote in the book this astonishing moment where Richard Sackler, who was a major figure in the company during this period of time, he's asked if he ever read the agreed statement of facts between the government and the company describing what the 2007 guilty plea was all about, and he says, "No, I never read it." And I just, to me, it seems I can understand that you would spend your good time and energy that you could on so many other things, helping them out the first time. The idea that 13 years later you would help them do it again, which she did, just strikes me as a strange one. And I think that the only way, I think a lot of people will read this book and say, how could they get away with it for so long? I think that's a question people have, right? How is it that they have gotten away with it again and again? And the answer is people like Mary Jo White. And again, it's not just Mary Jo White. There's any number of facilitators who do this kind of thing. I think what has been strange for me is anybody who's written about crime, as you will know as well, Matt, right? Like there's the kind of profile of a mob lawyer, right? If you talk to like a kind of a criminal defense lawyer or a mob lawyer, they have a kind of devil may care, like morally ambiguous, kind of winking sense
slippery.
That they're like,
yeah,
they're a little slippery, and they kind of love it, and it's their personality. But like, there would never be any sense of them holding themselves out there as like paragons of
integrity and
integrity and what have you.
Upstanding, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And so for me, it's just this funny thing where you get these moments, and I mean, you don't take it from me. Maura Healey, the Attorney General of Massachusetts, said that when she's thinking about charging the Sacklers personally, Mary Jo White comes to Boston and asks for a meeting, and they end up hiring as local counsel this woman who is like a good friend and mentor of Maura Healey. And and Maura Healey said that didn't feel like a coincidence to me. It felt like I was being sort of boxed in. There's a line that Maura Healey's deputy used. I quoted in the book. She talked about how when she was in law school, a law school professor of hers said this thing to her that she always thought about, and I think this really captures it for me as well. He said, "Everybody is entitled to an attorney, but that doesn't mean it has to be you."
I was just looking at that line right now. It's a perfect place to segue to some questions from our audience that have been submitted in advance. And one of them is, let's see here. In the case of the Sackler family, when and how did greed take over and surpass safety concerns about OxyContin? And it's a question from Judy. So if you could pinpoint a specific time when you think the greed, eclipsed everything else, or was that, the template created by Arthur Sackler?
So thank you, Judy. Great question. I don't know that there is a single point. And I would say, greed is an important part of this story. But there's also something else that kind of goes hand in hand with it, which is a sort of stubbornness and a refusal to admit any doubt or to admit that you could have been wrong about anything. So for me, if there's a really significant moment in the story of OxyContin in particular, it's actually not when the company developed the drug or made the effort to go out there and persuade American doctors that it wasn't addictive, or sold it in the first case, or when it started doing huge business. The really key moment in my mind is when word starts filtering back pretty early on that actually maybe it is addictive, and people are abusing it, and people are overdosing, and people are dying. The real test for me is, how do you react then? What do you do then? And I don't mean to suggest that they should have pulled it from the shelves even, but I think there could have been a moment where they would just take a pause and look at their own conduct and look at the way in which they were marketing the drug and appreciate that people were dying, and think about that. And that didn't happen.
There's another question, which is along the lines of, our discussion of Mary Jo White, these other white shoe attorneys, but it's from Mahalia, and she asked, what role do you think the legal system has had in the pain treatment industry, and how has the legal system failed people in the opioid crisis?
Oh, thank you, Mahalia. I think the legal system has failed us all around. I think you end up in this kind of perverse situation in which we continue to have an overly punitive war on drugs that cracks down both on those involved in selling and buying and using drugs on a kind of retail level, on a small level, and then turns a blind eye to the behavior of big pharma. And I think that you see that really across the board. You see it in terms of the Justice Department, in the case of Purdue, not once but twice offering these kind of sweetheart deals. I won't go into too much detail, but this recent guilty plea, which they were rushing to finish up at the end of the Trump administration because they wanted to wrap it up before the change of administration. You have a situation in which the company pleads guilty, but there's no executives who plead guilty. And in fact, there were no executives even named. I say in the book, it was as if the corporation were a driverless car. It's like, how could the corporation plead guilty to something and you don't tell us the name of a single employee who did anything wrong? To me, that is actually fairly typical of the way in which this operates. But I think you've got systemic failure across the board. I tell stories in the book about the failures of the FDA. So the Sacklers are very quick to say, hey, we only ever sold a drug that was approved by the FDA. But how much confidence that gives you depends on how much confidence you have in the FDA as a regulator. And I would submit that you shouldn't have all that much.
a question that I had that just on your recent comments was what's next for the Sacklers, though? Is there any this next generation? What's next for them, and what's level of involvement do they have with Purdue Pharma? And is there any chance that the Biden administration will revisit, or can they, holding Purdue and the Sacklers accountable?
So, I mean, I think we're going to see what happens in the next few months. The next few months will determine really what happens with the family. There is a bankruptcy plan. What the Sacklers are proposing is that Purdue Pharma, which is, you have this kind of crazy situation in which they, over the course of about a decade, they took $10 billion out of the company, just pulling it out, 300 million here, 400 million there, very, very kind of conscientiously pulling money out of the company until the company had hardly any money left. And at that point, the family pushes the company into bankruptcy. So you have this strange spectacle where Purdue Pharma is in bankruptcy and the Sacklers are sitting on the sidelines, having taken $10 billion out of it, and they're not declaring bankruptcy. They're proposing that they give up Purdue, it become what they call a public benefit company, which will continue to sell OxyContin, but the proceeds would go to address the opioid epidemic, and that the Sacklers would put up about $4 billion, about $4.25 billion of their own money, and then get a release basically from all these lawsuits against them. So the question is going to become whether or not that plan is approved by the states, whether or not it goes through. There's a new bill in Congress right now called the Sackler Act, which would prevent the bankruptcy judge from releasing them from all those lawsuits. So there's a lot that's hanging in the balance. In terms of future generations, it's hard to say. I mean, I think that they won't be involved in Purdue, certainly. It does seem likely that they will walk away with the vast bulk of their wealth intact. But I think that they're going to walk away with a name that has been significantly and probably permanently tarnished.
Have they or their representatives offered any feedback on the book since it was released last week?
Not yet, no. I mean, they had, I think it's been about 10 days since we've gotten a legal letter.
Okay.
So, which is, probably a momentary lull. But no, haven't heard anything.
They're writing it right now. Yeah.
Exactly. I'm sure as we speak, we'll probably get one in response to this conversation.
Yes. I mean, is there? I know you haven't been able to talk to any of the Sacklers, but I guess if you could pick one or two of them that you wish you could talk to, who would they be, and what would you want to ask?
Well, yeah. I mean, I feel as though it's funny. I would have I mean, it would be interesting to talk with Richard Sackler. He's so stubborn, and it would be very interesting to see what that conversation would be like, because he's having seen so many of his conversations play out over email. It's not as though it's not like, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that he amends his own views. I think instead he would kind of continue to make his points without a shadow of a doubt, which is what he does. But it would be interesting to have the opportunity to do that. And Madeline Sackler, the filmmaker, I was really intrigued by, just because I think that she's made really interesting films. She's clearly a very thoughtful person, but I do think that she has this kind of intriguing blind side when it comes to her own. So she, for instance, made a pair of films about prisons and mass incarceration. And to me, the notion that an opioid heiress could make films about mass incarceration and not be ready to answer questions about whether there's a connection between those two things struck me as just a very peculiar kind of willful blindness. And so I had actually hoped that she might speak with me, but she didn't. But I did talk to Jeffrey Wright, the actor who was in one of those films, and he ended up having really interesting things to say.
Well, Patrick, I just wanted to thank you for joining our conversation this morning, or it's afternoon for you. I really appreciated this. I loved the book. I thought it was terrific. And I hope everyone listening really goes out and buys a copy of Empire of Pain. You can check it out at Roman's Bookstore, which is available for purchase. But please, check out the book. And thank you, Patrick, for your time this morning. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, likewise. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us.